Marcus Washington had exactly 18 hours left to live. 45 years old, a black father of three, sitting on death row for a murder he didn't commit. The system had failed him at every turn, not because of the evidence, but because of something he could never change: the color of his skin. His dark brown hands trembled as he clutched his worn Bible in that freezing cell, praying desperately for a miracle he didn't believe could happen anymore. But what Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know in his deepest despair, was that in exactly 11 hours, someone would walk through those concrete walls, someone who had been executed by an unjust system 2,000 years ago, someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be condemned for speaking truth. Jesus was coming to cell block D, and nothing, absolutely nothing, not the guards, not the warden, not the state of Texas itself, could stop what was about to happen in that 6 by 8 foot cell, where an innocent black man was counting down his final hours on earth. The cold steel bench had been Marcus's bed for 4,382 days, 12 years, 4 months and 6 days he had counted, every single sunrise he wasn't supposed to see, every single sunset that brought him closer to death. The cell measured exactly 6 feet by 8 feet, painted that institutional pale green designed specifically to crush the human spirit, to remind prisoners they were no longer human beings with rights and dignity, but numbers, statistics, bodies warehoused until the state decided it was time to dispose of them. It was 2:47 in the morning, on what would be his last full day breathing air on this earth. The execution was scheduled for exactly 9 p.m. the following evening, which meant that in precisely 18 hours and 13 minutes from this very moment, correctional officers would come to his cell, would place him in restraints, would walk him down that long corridor death row inmates called the last mile, would strap his black body onto a gurney designed specifically for killing human beings. 18 hours to live, 18 hours to pray, 18 hours to hope for a miracle that had eluded him through 12 years of denied appeals, 12 years of lawyers who didn't believe him, 12 years of judges who looked at his black face and saw guilt before they ever examined the evidence, 12 years of a justice system that had been anything but just from the very first moment they slammed handcuffs around his dark wrists. His skin, that beautiful deep brown, that his mama had always told him was a gift from God, that his wife Angela had kissed and loved and cherished, that his 3 babies had inherited in various shades, now felt like a target painted permanently on his body, a mark that told the world he was guilty before any evidence was presented, before any trial began, before any jury deliberated. His hair had gone completely gray during his time on death row, transformed from the jet black of his youth, into silver and white streaks that made him look much older than his 45 years. The prison was quieter at this hour than it ever was during the day, quieter than the chaos of shift changes and meal times, and the endless metallic clanging of doors opening and closing, opening and closing, opening and closing, the soundtrack of incarceration that never stopped, never paused, never gave you a moment of true silence. But at 2:47 in the morning, there were no guards making their rounds with their flashlights in their suspicion, no other inmates shouting or crying, or praying, or losing their minds in the special kind of madness that death row created in men who had too much time to think about their mortality. Just the perpetual electrical hum of fluorescent lights that never turned off, never dimmed, never gave you the mercy of real darkness where you could hide from your thoughts, and the occasional drip 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 of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the ancient building that the state of Texas had been using to warehouse condemned men for over 100 years. Lord, he whispered into the darkness of his cell, his deep voice barely audible even to his own ears, cracking with emotion that he had tried so hard to keep buried, tried so hard to control, because crying on death row was seen as weakness, and weakness could get you hurt or killed, even before the state got around to doing it officially. I don't understand why this is happening to me. I've tried so hard to understand, Lord. I've prayed for understanding every single day for 12 years. I've searched the scriptures for answers. I've begged you to show me what lesson I'm supposed to learn from this nightmare. But I'm just a man, just a black man in Texas who made the mistake of standing up for himself. And I'm so scared. I'm so completely, absolutely, totally scared of dying for something I didn't do. Tears began to flow down his cheeks, hot against his cool skin, streaming down his dark brown face in rivers that he didn't even try to wipe away anymore. But something felt different tonight. Something Marcus couldn't quite explain or put into words even if someone had asked him to describe it. There was a warmth in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the temperature of the cell. A sensation like a tiny flame had been lit somewhere behind his ribcage, glowing softly, pushing back against the cold terror that had been his constant companion since the warden had come to his cell 3 days ago, to inform him that his final appeal had been denied, that the governor had refused to grant clemency, that his execution would proceed as scheduled. There was a sense of anticipation humming through his body, making the hairs on his dark arms stand at attention, making his skin tingle as if electricity was running just beneath the surface, a feeling that made absolutely no logical sense for a man with less than a day to live, a man who had run out of options and hope and reasons to believe that anything good could possibly happen. Lord, he prayed again, his voice stronger now, less broken, filled with a desperate hope that surprised even himself. If you're really there, if you really see me, this black man that the world has thrown away like garbage, this father who's going to be ripped away from his children, this husband who's going to leave his wife a widow, I need you now. I need you more than I have ever needed anything in my entire life. My babies need their daddy. Angela needs her husband. My mama needs her son. I need a miracle, Lord. I need the kind of miracle that only you can perform. I need you to move in a way that defies human understanding, that breaks through these concrete walls and these steel bars in this unjust system. I need you to show up, Lord. Please, please show up for this black man who the world said doesn't matter. Please prove them wrong. Please let me know that my life has meaning, that my suffering hasn't been in vain. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he knelt on that cold concrete floor in cell block D of Huntsville State Penitentiary, was that his prayer was already being answered, that the miracle he was begging for was already in motion, that somewhere beyond the jurisdiction of wardens and governors, and the Supreme Court of Texas, somewhere beyond the reach of human law and human prejudice and human cruelty, someone had already heard his cry, and had already begun the journey to that 6 by 8 foot cell, where an innocent black man was counting down his final hours. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, was coming to Texas, and he was coming specifically for Marcus Washington, coming to visit him just as he had promised in Scripture that he would visit those in prison, coming to fulfill his word that he would never leave nor forsake those who called upon his name, coming because he had always had a special love for the condemned, the marginalized, those crushed by unjust systems. The story of how Marcus Washington, a good black man, a faithful husband, a loving father, a skilled carpenter who had never committed a violent crime in his entire life, ended up on death row waiting to die for a murder he absolutely did not commit, was a story as old as America itself. A story that had been written in the blood of countless black men who had been lynched by mobs, executed by states, killed by a justice system that saw their skin color before it saw their humanity. A story that continued generation after generation, despite all the progress that America claimed to have made, despite all the laws that had been passed, despite all the speeches about equality and justice for all. It was a story written in the blood of Emmett Till, that 14-year-old black boy who was brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955 for allegedly whistling at a white woman, his killers acquitted by an all-white jury despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt. Marcus Washington's story was individual in its specific details, but universal in its theme, a black man crushed by a system designed to crush black men, a system that had its roots in slavery when black bodies were property to be bought and sold and worked to death, that had evolved through Jim Crow when black lives were controlled through terrorism and segregation, that had transformed into mass incarceration when the war on drugs became a war on black communities. The statistics told the story that the system refused to acknowledge. Black Americans made up 13% of the United States population, but 42% of death row inmates. In cases where the victim was white and the defendant was black, death sentences were handed down at dramatically higher rates than in any other racial combination. Studies showed that all-white juries were significantly more likely to convict black defendants and recommend death sentences compared to racially diverse juries. Prosecutors used challenges to systematically exclude black potential jurors, ensuring that black defendants faced juries that didn't include anyone who looked like them. 12 years earlier, before death row, before the trial, before the arrest, Marcus Washington had been living what he believed was a good life. Maybe not the American dream in its fullest expression, because Marcus was smart enough and aware enough to know that the American dream had always been more available to white Americans than black Americans, but a decent life nonetheless, an honest life, a life he was proud of despite its challenges and limitations. He worked as a master carpenter for Rivera Construction Company, one of the most respected commercial construction firms in the greater Houston metropolitan area, a company that built office buildings and shopping centers and apartment complexes throughout Harris County and beyond. Marcus's hands, those strong, dark, capable hands, could transform raw lumber into architectural beauty, could read the grain of wood, and know exactly how to cut it, how to shape it, how to join it with other pieces to create structures that would stand for generations. But Marcus Washington was also painfully, constantly, unavoidably aware that he was one of only 3 black men on a construction crew of 47 workers at Rivera Construction, and that fact colored absolutely everything about his work experience, literally and figuratively. He knew, because he had overheard them when they thought he wasn't listening, that some of his white co-workers made jokes about him behind his back, jokes about fried chicken and watermelon, jokes about how he must know where to buy drugs, jokes about how he probably had multiple children with different women, jokes that relied on every racist stereotype that white America had created about black men and refused to let die even in the 21st century. He knew that he had to arrive at the job site at least 30 minutes earlier than his white counterparts, and had to work at least 2 hours longer, had to produce work of obviously superior quality, just to be considered equal to white workers who showed up late and left early and did mediocre work, but never faced the same scrutiny, never had their competence questioned. He knew that promotions to foreman and supervisor positions consistently went to white workers who had less experience, inferior skills, and worse work records, while Marcus and the other 2 black carpenters were passed over again and again despite their obvious qualifications, despite their seniority, despite their superior craftsmanship. He had watched white men who he had personally trained, who had asked him questions and sought his advice, and learned from his expertise, get promoted above him, had watched them become his supervisors, had watched them give him orders and correct his work even though everyone on the job site knew that Marcus Washington was the best carpenter in the entire company, and probably one of the best in all of Houston. He knew these things with absolute certainty, because he was a black man in America, and knowing these things, navigating these racial landmines, developing strategies to survive in predominantly white spaces while maintaining your dignity and sanity, was part of the unwritten survival manual that gets passed down from black fathers to black sons. Keep your head down, the manual said. Work twice as hard to get half as far. Don't give them an excuse to fire you, to arrest you, to hurt you, to kill you. Don't make white people uncomfortable with your intelligence, your confidence, your success, your blackness. Smile even when you don't feel like smiling, especially when you don't feel like smiling, because an angry black man is a dangerous black man in white eyes, a threat that must be neutralized. Be grateful for opportunities that you're more than qualified for, opportunities that white people take for granted as their birthright. Remember that your skin is a uniform you can never take off, that some people will always see it as a threat, as a problem, as evidence of inferiority, no matter how educated you are, how articulate you are, how successful you are, how perfectly you perform respectability and assimilation. Marcus had endured it all with grace and patience that would have broken lesser men, had swallowed his pride daily, had bitten his tongue until he tasted blood. His wife Angela Washington, beautiful and strong with her dark skin that glowed like polished mahogany and her natural hair, that she wore in twists and braids, and afros that celebrated her blackness instead of hiding it, worked as a registered nurse at Houston Methodist Hospital in the Texas Medical Center, one of the largest medical complexes in the world. She was brilliant at her job, compassionate with patients, skilled in her medical knowledge, meticulous in her care, respected by most of her colleagues, who worked closely enough with her to see past their own biases, but she faced her own daily battles with racism in the healthcare system. She dealt with patients who took one look at her black face and refused to let that black nurse touch them, who requested white nurses instead, who complained to administrators that they didn't feel safe with her caring for them, even though Angela had more training and experience than most of the white nurses on her floor, even though she had never made a medical error in her 10 years of clinical practice. Together, Marcus and Angela Washington were raising 3 beautiful black children in a world that would judge them, stereotype them, and discriminate against them before they ever opened their mouths to speak, before anyone knew anything about their character, their intelligence, their dreams, their humanity. Their daughter Jasmine was 14 years old when her father was arrested, already painfully aware that her blackness made her simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, already experiencing the specific kind of racism and sexism that black girls and women face, already learning that she would have to be perfect just to be considered adequate. Marcus Jr. was 11 years old, already getting the talk from his father about how to interact with police officers, how to keep his hands visible at all times, how to say yes sir and no sir, how to never make sudden movements, how to survive being a black boy in America, where black boys are seen as threats from the moment they enter adolescence. And little Elijah, only 7 years old when his father was taken away, still innocent enough to believe that everyone was treated fairly, for his family, for these three precious children, and his devoted wife Marcus Washington swallowed his pride every single day, endured indignities that would have broken other men, accepted mistreatment that no human being should have to accept, because he was a black father in America, and black fathers know that providing for your children sometimes means sacrificing your own dignity, means taking abuse from white bosses who see you as less than human, means working in environments that make it clear you're not wanted or valued. He endured his boss Daniel Westbrook's casual racism, the kind that came wrapped in jokes and stereotypes rather than slurs, the kind that many white people insisted wasn't really racism at all, just harmless fun, just the way guys joke around. Westbrook was a third-generation contractor, white, wealthy, and completely oblivious to his own privilege, the kind of man who would insist loudly that he wasn't racist because he had hired black workers, as if employing black people while treating them poorly was somehow proof of racial enlightenment, until the day that Daniel Westbrook went too far, crossed a line that even Marcus Washington with all his patience and self-control couldn't ignore, pushed him into a corner where staying silent would have meant completely abandoning his dignity as a human being. It was a Friday afternoon in August, the Texas heat absolutely oppressive, the kind of humid blazing heat that made working outside feel like torture. Westbrook was in a foul mood because Rivera Construction had just lost a major contract, and he needed someone to blame, someone to unleash his anger on. Marcus Washington, hard-working, talented Marcus, was convenient, was available, was black, which meant Westbrook could attack him with confidence that there would be no real consequences. Washington, Westbrook had shouted across the job site, loud enough that every worker stopped to watch, "Get over here. You completely screwed up these measurements. Can you not read a blueprint? Did they not teach you basic skills in whatever school you went to?" The words hung in the air like poison, racial undertones clear to everyone listening. Marcus felt every eye turned toward him, felt the weight of expectations, of stereotypes, of the survival manual telling him to stay silent, to apologize, to accept blame he didn't deserve. But something in Marcus snapped that day. Some internal wire stretched too tight finally broke. He set down his tools and walked toward Westbrook with dignity, pulling out his copy of the blueprint marked with his precise calculations. "Mr. Westbrook, sir," he said calmly, "these measurements are
Exactly, according to your approved specifications.
I have your signature right here. The framing is correct. Actually, I reinforced it beyond code requirements for structural integrity. I did my job well." The job site went completely silent. Workers stared, shocked that a black man had dared to defend himself, dared to prove he was right with documentation. Westbrook's face turned purple with rage. "You're talking back to me," he hissed. "You're arguing with me in front of my crew. Do you know how easily I could replace you? Do you know who I am?" Marcus stood his ground, didn't lower his eyes, didn't adopt the submissive posture that Westbrook clearly expected, clearly demanded. "With all due respect, Mr. Westbrook, I'm not arguing. I'm showing you proof that I did the work correctly. You questioned my competence in front of everyone. I have the right to defend my professional reputation with facts." The other workers gasped audibly at that, actually gasped because they all knew that Marcus Washington had just crossed a line that black employees weren't supposed to cross in Texas, had challenged white authority in a way that would have consequences, serious consequences. "You're fired," Westbrook said flatly, his voice cold. "Get your tools and get off my site. Don't ask for a reference because I'll make sure every construction company in Houston knows you're insubordinate, that you don't respect authority." Marcus collected his tools slowly, maintaining dignity even in defeat. A co-worker named Jorge helped him, whispering that what Westbrook did was wrong. "Take care, brother," Jorge said. "You're a good man. The truth will come out." But the truth didn't come out. Not in any way that mattered. Not in any way that saved Marcus Washington from what was about to happen to him. 3 days later, Daniel Westbrook was found dead in his luxury home in River Oaks, shot twice in the chest with a 9mm handgun. And Marcus Washington, unemployed black man with a grudge against the victim, black man who had been publicly humiliated and fired just days before the murder, black man whose skin color made him automatically suspicious in the eyes of a police force and criminal justice system that had been criminalizing black bodies since before the Civil War ended, became suspect number one from the moment the investigation began. Houston police descended on Marcus's modest home in the 3rd Ward at dawn, with search warrants and arrest warrants, and enough tactical officers to invade a small country, treating Marcus like a dangerous armed fugitive, instead of a father of 3 who had never committed a violent crime in his entire life, who didn't even own a gun, who had been at home with his family the night of the murder. The evidence against Marcus Washington was circumstantial at best, completely fabricated at worst, the kind of evidence that would have been laughed out of court if the defendant had been white and wealthy instead of black and working class. The prosecution's entire case rested on a few key points that they hammered again and again throughout the trial, points that seemed damning on the surface but fell apart completely under scrutiny if anyone had bothered to actually scrutinize them, if anyone had actually cared about the truth instead of just closing the case and getting a conviction. First, they argued that Marcus had motive because Westbrook had fired him publicly and humiliated him, because Marcus was angry and resentful and wanted revenge. Never mind that being fired wasn't actually a good motive for murder, that thousands of people get fired every day without killing their former bosses, that Marcus had no history whatsoever of violence or retaliation, that everyone who knew him described him as peaceful and level-headed and slow to anger. The prosecutors painted him as an angry black man consumed by rage, playing into every racist stereotype about black male violence, about black men being unable to control their emotions, about black men being dangerous and primitive and prone to explosive violence that white men supposedly weren't capable of. Second, they claimed that gunshot residue had been found on Marcus's hands and clothes when he was arrested 1 week after the murder, scientific evidence that proved he had recently fired a weapon. Never mind that the defense would later prove that the gunshot residue testing had been contaminated, that the samples had been mishandled by the forensic technician, that the detective who collected the evidence had a long documented history of planting evidence on black suspects in previous cases, that independent testing ordered by the defense found absolutely no gunshot residue whatsoever. The jury heard gunshot residue and heard scientific evidence and believed it because people trust science, people trust forensics, people have watched too many crime shows on television and believe that forensic evidence is infallible. Third and most damningly, they had a witness who claimed to have seen Marcus's truck parked outside Westbrook's house on the night of the murder, who claimed to have seen a black man matching Marcus's description leaving the property around the time the medical examiner estimated death occurred. That witness was Kenneth Morrison, a white neighbor of Westbrook's who lived 3 houses down in River Oaks, one of the wealthiest and whitest neighborhoods in Houston, a neighborhood where black men were automatically suspicious just by virtue of being present, where black men were assumed to be criminals or service workers rather than residents or legitimate visitors. Kenneth Morrison would testify with absolute certainty that he had seen Marcus Washington's truck, a blue Ford F-150 with Rivera Construction logos that Marcus had forgotten to remove after being fired, parked on the street outside Westbrook's mansion at approximately 10:15 p.m. on the night of August 19th. He would testify that he had seen a tall black man in dark clothing leaving the property at approximately 10:30 p.m. He testified that he had thought it was suspicious because black people didn't belong in River Oaks at that time of night unless they were working as security guards or domestic help, that he had made a mental note of the truck and the man but hadn't called police immediately because he didn't want to seem racist, didn't want to be accused of racial profiling. Never mind that Marcus's truck was one of the most common vehicles in Texas, that hundreds of identical blue Ford F-150s existed in the Houston area alone, that Rivera Construction had 17 other trucks exactly like it. Never mind that Marcus had an alibi for the night of the murder, that he had been at home with his wife and children the entire evening, that Angela would testify under oath that her husband had been there watching television and helping their youngest son with homework and making love to her before they went to sleep. Never mind that Kenneth Morrison's testimony was riddled with inconsistencies, that he had initially told police he wasn't sure about the identification, that he only became certain after being shown Marcus's photo multiple times by detectives who clearly believed Marcus was guilty. The jury believed Kenneth Morrison because he was white and respectable and lived in River Oaks and had no obvious reason to lie, at least no reason that the all-white jury could recognize or acknowledge. They didn't see that Kenneth Morrison got to be a hero in his own mind, got to be the key witness who solved a murder, got to be important and valued by law enforcement, got to feel like he had contributed to justice and safety in taking a dangerous black criminal off the streets. They didn't see that his certainty had grown in direct proportion to the attention and validation he received from prosecutors, that his memory had become clearer and more detailed with each retelling until he was describing things he couldn't possibly have seen from 3 houses away at night, until his testimony sounded rehearsed and scripted and too perfect to be actual human memory. The trial lasted exactly 2 weeks, which was actually fast for a capital murder case, fast because the prosecutor was confident in his case, fast because the defense attorney assigned to Marcus was overworked and underpaid and handling 30 other cases simultaneously. Marcus's court-appointed attorney was a white man named Gerald Thompson who had graduated from a mid-tier law school 15 years earlier and had been working in the public defender's office ever since, burning out slowly but steadily under impossible caseloads and minimal resources, becoming more cynical and less effective with each passing year. Thompson had met with Marcus exactly 4 times before the trial began, had spent maybe 10 total hours on his case, had barely reviewed the evidence, had failed to hire expert witnesses who could have challenged the forensic evidence, had failed to conduct an independent investigation that would have uncovered the truth, had failed to prepare Marcus for testimony, had failed in almost every way that a defense attorney could fail except that he showed up to court and went through the motions and could truthfully say that Marcus Washington had received legal representation as required by the Sixth Amendment. The jury was selected in 2 days, 12 people who would decide whether Marcus Washington lived or died, 12 people who were supposed to be impartial but who were selected from a jury pool in Harris County, Texas. The final jury was all white, 8 men and 4 women, ranging in age from 32 to 68. Not a single person of color among them, not a single person who might understand from personal experience what it meant to be a black man in America, what it meant to be presumed guilty, what it meant to be feared and suspected and criminalized just for existing. Marcus had looked at that jury, and had known in his gut that he was doomed, had known that these 12 white faces were going to see him as guilty before they heard a single piece of evidence, that they would believe the white witness and the white prosecutors and disbelieve the black defendant and his black wife no matter what the facts actually showed. Angela had squeezed his hand in the courtroom, had whispered that God would reveal the truth, that justice would prevail, but Marcus had seen the way the jurors looked at him, the way they flinched slightly when he stood up, the way they wouldn't make eye contact with him, the way they seemed already convinced that he was exactly what the prosecutor said he was. The prosecution had painted Marcus as a stereotypical angry black man during their opening statement, had described him as resentful and violent and consumed with rage over being fired, had suggested that his calm demeanor in the courtroom was just an act, that the real Marcus Washington was a ticking time bomb who had finally exploded and killed his white boss in cold blood. They had used words like thug and aggressive and threatening, words that have specific racial connotations in America, words that white men accused of murder rarely hear applied to them, but that get attached to black men almost automatically. When Marcus took the stand in his own defense, which Thompson had advised against, but Marcus had insisted on because he needed to tell his truth, needed to look those jurors in the eye and tell them he was innocent, the prosecution had torn into him with questions designed to make him look angry, to provoke him, to get him to raise his voice or show emotion so they could point at him and say, "See, this is the real Marcus Washington. This is the violent, angry black man we've been telling you about." Marcus had tried so hard to stay calm, to speak clearly and respectfully, to explain what actually happened, but the harder he tried to control his emotions, the more the prosecutor suggested he was being calculated and manipulative, performing for the jury, hiding his true nature. And when Marcus did show emotion, when his voice broke talking about his children, when tears came to his eyes thinking about being separated from his family, the prosecutor had suggested those tears were fake, were manipulation, were an attempt to prey on the jury's sympathy. Angela had testified beautifully, had told the jury with absolute certainty that her husband had been home all evening on the night of the murder, that he had been watching a basketball game with Marcus Jr., that he had helped Elijah with his spelling homework, that he had made love to her before they went to sleep, that there was no possible way he could have driven to River Oaks and murdered Daniel Westbrook because he was with his family the entire time. But the prosecutor had suggested that Angela was lying to protect her husband, that wives always lie for their husbands. The jury had deliberated for exactly 47 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict. 47 minutes to decide that Marcus Washington would spend the rest of his life in prison, or possibly even be executed. 47 minutes to overturn the presumption of innocence. 47 minutes to destroy a family and condemn an innocent man. 47 minutes was barely enough time to review the evidence, barely enough time to discuss the case seriously, barely enough time to do anything except confirm what they had already decided before deliberations even began, which was that Marcus Washington was guilty because of course he was guilty. Look at him, look at his skin, look at his face. When the verdict was read, Marcus had felt his soul leave his body, had felt himself become disconnected from reality, floating somewhere above the courtroom watching this nightmare happen to someone else. Angela had screamed, "No, no, no," from the gallery, had collapsed sobbing, had to be held up by Marcus's mother and sister. His children had been there, had watched their father be declared guilty of murder. The sentencing phase had been almost worse than the trial itself, because now the prosecution was seeking the death penalty, was arguing that Marcus Washington deserved to die for killing Daniel Westbrook, that society would be safer with him dead, that he was beyond redemption, beyond rehabilitation, a monster who needed to be put down like a rabid animal. They had brought in Westbrook's family to testify about their loss, their pain, their grief, how this violent criminal had stolen their beloved Daniel from them. They didn't mention that Daniel Westbrook had been a racist who treated his black employees like property, who humiliated them publicly, who fired them for defending themselves. The jury recommended death, unanimously, without hesitation, without apparent difficulty. Marcus Washington would be executed by the state of Texas for a murder he did not commit, would be taken to death row at Huntsville State Penitentiary, would spend what remained of his life in a 6 by 8 foot cell waiting for the state to kill him. That had been 12 years ago. 12 years of appeals that went nowhere, of lawyers who filed motions and lost them. 12 years of watching his children grow up through glass partitions during brief visits, watching Jasmine graduate high school and start college, watching Marcus Jr. become a man, watching Elijah grow from a little boy into a teenager who barely remembered what it was like to have his father at home. 12 years of Angela working 2 jobs to pay the bills and support the children, and still find time to visit him, to maintain her faith that somehow someday the truth would come out, that God would intervene, that justice would finally prevail. But justice hadn't prevailed, and now Marcus Washington had exactly 18 hours left to live, had run out of appeals and options and miracles, had nothing left except prayer, except faith, except the desperate hope that God was real and God was listening and God cared about what happened to one innocent black man in a Texas prison. He knelt on the cold concrete floor of his cell, his brown hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles went pale, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. But what Marcus Washington didn't know, what he couldn't see with his physical eyes or understand with his human mind, was that his prayer had already been heard, that the King of Kings had already responded, that even now, at this very moment, Jesus Christ was approaching cell block D of Huntsville State Penitentiary, was coming specifically for him, was about to enter that cell and change everything, not just for Marcus Washington, but for everyone whose life would be touched by what was about to happen. Because Jesus still visits prisoners, just like he promised. Jesus still cares about the condemned, the marginalized, the forgotten, the victims of unjust systems. Jesus still performs miracles, and cell block D was about to witness one of the most extraordinary miracles in modern times. A miracle that would shake the foundations of the Texas criminal justice system. A miracle that would prove beyond doubt that God sees, God knows, and God acts on behalf of those who cry out to him in their darkest hour. Marcus Washington's final prayer was about to be answered in ways he couldn't imagine. The air in Marcus's cell began to shift, to change, to become charged with something that defied natural explanation. The temperature rose slightly, not uncomfortably but noticeably, pushing back the perpetual chill that characterized death row. The fluorescent lights seemed to flicker, though they didn't actually dim or brighten, as if the very nature of light itself was being altered by an invisible presence. Marcus felt it before he saw anything, felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with his body temperature, and everything to do with something spiritual, something divine, something that made every nerve ending in his body come alive with anticipation. He opened his eyes slowly, almost afraid of what he might see. almost afraid that this feeling was just his mind playing tricks on him in the final hours before death, giving him comfort that wasn't real, hope that would only make the execution more painful when it finally came. But what he saw made him gasp, made him fall backward onto his steel bench, made his heart race with something between terror and wonder. There was someone standing in his cell, a man, dressed in simple clothes that seemed timeless, neither modern nor ancient, just simple and clean and somehow perfect. The man's face was difficult to look at directly, not because it was bright or shining with supernatural light like in the religious paintings Marcus had seen, but because it radiated such perfect compassion, such infinite love, such deep understanding that Marcus felt completely naked before it, felt like every secret he'd ever kept, every fear he'd ever harbored, every doubt he'd ever experienced was visible to this stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger at all. The man's eyes were dark and kind and seemed to contain centuries of wisdom and pain and joy all at once. His hands, hanging relaxed at his sides, bore faint scars on the wrists, scars that looked old but somehow still fresh, scars that told a story Marcus was beginning to understand. "Marcus," the man said, and his voice was like nothing Marcus had ever heard, like honey and thunder, like whispers and shouts, like everything beautiful and terrible and true all combined into sound. "Marcus Washington," the man continued, stepping closer, and Marcus noticed that he made no sound as he moved, that his feet seemed to barely touch the concrete floor. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus couldn't speak, his throat completely closed with emotion, with recognition, with the overwhelming certainty that he was in the presence of something holy, something divine, something that shouldn't be possible, but was undeniably real. He managed to shake his head, though part of him already knew. Part of him had known from the moment he'd felt that warmth in his chest. "I am the one you've been praying to," the man said gently. "I am Jesus. I am the one who was executed though innocent, who knows what it feels like to be condemned by a system that refused to see truth, who understands your pain in ways that no human being possibly could. I have come because you called for me. I have come because I promised I would visit those in prison. I have come because your suffering has reached my ears and your tears have reached my heart." Marcus fell to his knees, overwhelmed, tears streaming down his dark face, his entire body shaking with sobs that came from the deepest part of his soul. "Jesus," he gasped, "you're really here. You're really real, in my cell, with me. A black man on death row. I thought maybe you'd forgotten about people like me, about black men in prison, about innocent people who get crushed by the system. I thought maybe the prayers weren't reaching you, or maybe you just didn't care about what happens down here in Texas." Jesus knelt beside him, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder, and the touch was electric, warm, filled with more love than Marcus had ever experienced in his entire life. "Marcus, look at me," Jesus said softly. Marcus raised his eyes, looked into that face that radiated perfect compassion. "I have never forgotten you, not for a single moment of these 12 years, not for a single second of your suffering. Every tear you've cried, I've collected. Every prayer you've prayed, I've heard. Every moment of injustice you've endured, I've witnessed." "But why?" Marcus sobbed. "Why did you let this happen to me? Why did you let them take me away from my family? Why did you let them convict me for something I didn't do? Why am I going to die tomorrow for a crime I didn't commit? If you're really here, if you really care, why didn't you stop this 12 years ago?" Jesus' face showed such deep sadness, such profound empathy, that Marcus felt his anger melting away even as he asked the questions. "Because I gave human beings free will," Jesus said quietly, "and with that free will comes the capacity for great evil as well as great good. The men who framed you, the prosecutors who cared more about winning than truth, the jury who saw your skin color before they saw your humanity, they all made choices, evil choices, unjust choices, choices that I wept over even as they were making them. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. This story isn't over. What looks like the end is actually a beginning. What seems like defeat is actually setting the stage for victory. What appears to be your death is actually going to be your deliverance." "What do you mean?" Marcus whispered. "How can my execution be deliverance? They're going to kill me tomorrow night. They're going to pump poison into my veins until my heart stops beating. How is that a beginning?" Jesus stood, pulling Marcus to his feet with surprising strength. "Come with me," he said. "There's something you need to see, someone you need to meet." Before Marcus could ask what he meant, Jesus touched the concrete wall of the cell, and it began to shimmer like water, like liquid light rippling and flowing as if it was no longer solid matter, but something else entirely. something that existed between the physical and spiritual realms. Marcus stared in absolute wonder as Jesus stepped through the wall as if it wasn't there, as if concrete and steel were no more substantial than morning mist. Jesus turned back, extending his hand. "Trust me, Marcus. Take my hand and walk through." Marcus hesitated for only a moment before grasping that scarred hand, feeling the warmth and strength flow from Jesus's fingers into his own, and together they stepped through solid concrete as if it was air. On the other side of the wall, Marcus found himself in a place that was and wasn't, Huntsville State Penitentiary, a space that existed somewhere between the physical prison and somewhere else, somewhere higher, somewhere divine. The corridor was the same institutional green, the same fluorescent lights, the same steel doors, but everything was overlaid with something else, a golden quality to the light, a sense of peace that no prison should possess, a feeling of being outside of time itself. Jesus led him down the corridor, past cell after cell, and Marcus could see through the walls as if they were transparent, could see the men inside, the condemned and the forgotten, the guilty and the innocent, the broken and the lost. In one cell, an older white man sat weeping, his face in his hands. In another, a young Latino man paced back and forth like a caged animal. In yet another, a black man younger than Marcus lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling with dead eyes that had given up hope years ago. "Do you see them?" Jesus asked gently. "Do you see my beloved sons, trapped in a system that was designed to destroy rather than restore, to punish rather than redeem, to warehouse rather than heal? Every single one of them, guilty or innocent, is precious to me. Every single one of them, black or white or brown, is made in my image. Every single one of them deserves dignity and justice and love, even if they've done terrible things, even if they've committed real crimes. But you, Marcus, you are innocent. You have done nothing to deserve this fate. And your innocence is about to become a light that exposes the darkness in this system." They continued walking until they came to a door that Marcus didn't recognize, a door that shouldn't exist in the death row unit, a door that led somewhere else entirely. Here, Jesus opened it, and beyond was a courtroom, but not a courtroom that existed in the physical world. This courtroom was vast and bright, with walls that seemed to extend into infinity, with a ceiling that looked like the night sky filled with stars, and seated at the judge's bench was a figure of such overwhelming authority and love that Marcus couldn't look directly at him, could only perceive him from the corner of his eye. Marcus Washington sat up fully on the execution gurney, looked directly at the warden and the guards and the witnesses, and spoke with a voice that carried supernatural authority. "I died," he said clearly, his words echoing through the execution chamber like thunder rolling across mountains. "You all saw me die. My heart stopped beating for exactly 3 minutes. The medical examiner pronounced me dead at 9:07 p.m. But God Almighty brought me back to life because I am innocent, because the truth must be told, because this system of injustice must be exposed and dismantled. Jesus Christ himself visited me in my cell last night. He showed me the truth about my case in the court of heaven, where lies cannot survive and corruption cannot hide. Kenneth Morrison lied when he identified me as the man he saw that night. Detective James Crawford planted the gunshot residue evidence on my clothing because he was convinced of my guilt and wanted to manufacture proof. Prosecutor Robert Chen systematically excluded every single black potential juror and knowingly used unreliable testimony, because winning his case mattered more to his career than discovering truth. I was convicted not because of evidence, but because of the color of my skin, because this system is fundamentally rigged against black men, because a jury of 12 white people looked at my black face and decided I was guilty before they ever heard testimony. Because being black in America means being presumed dangerous and criminal regardless of your actual character or actions. But God has vindicated me tonight in the most undeniable way possible. He allowed your poison to kill me, allowed my heart to stop, allowed death to take me, and then he reached down into death itself and pulled me back to life to prove my innocence before all these witnesses, to demonstrate his power over systems that claim authority they don't actually possess, to expose the corruption that condemned me and countless others like me. I am Marcus Washington, innocent of the crime for which I was executed, and God Almighty has declared it so by raising me from the dead in this execution chamber before cameras and witnesses who cannot deny what they have seen with their own eyes. The execution chamber erupted into absolute chaos, unlike anything that had ever occurred in the history of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Guards stumbled backward in shock and terror, some of them falling over equipment, others pressing themselves against walls as if trying to disappear into the concrete. The medical examiner who had just pronounced Marcus dead 3 minutes earlier now stood frozen in place, his clipboard fallen to the floor, his face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water but no sounds emerging. The warden, a man who had overseen 43 executions during his 20-year career without ever showing visible emotion, now stood trembling, his hand gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his eyes wide with something between awe and terror, as he stared at the dead man who was now sitting up and speaking. In the witness room separated from the execution chamber by thick glass windows, pandemonium reigned absolutely and completely. Members of Daniel Westbrook's family who had come to see justice done were now screaming, some in horror, others in confusion, several fainting and being caught by prison officials who didn't know whether to maintain order or abandon their posts and run. The media representatives were frantically trying to capture everything on cameras and recording devices, knowing they were witnessing something that would dominate news cycles for months or years, something that defied rational explanation, something that would force every news organization in the world to grapple with questions about miracles and divine intervention and the possibility that God actually does intervene directly in human affairs. Prison officials in the witness area were shouting into radios, calling for backup, calling for medical assistance, calling for somebody in authority to tell them what to do because their training manuals had never covered the scenario of an executed prisoner coming back to life and sitting up to proclaim his innocence with supernatural authority. And in the witness section reserved for the condemned man's family, Angela Washington had collapsed into her chair, her body shaking with sobs that were equal parts joy and shock and overwhelming relief and the sudden release of 12 years of accumulated grief and fear and desperate faith that had finally been vindicated in the most spectacular way imaginable. Marcus's mother was on her knees praying loudly in a voice that carried through the glass, thanking God, praising Jesus, declaring that she had always known her son was innocent, that she had never stopped believing that truth would prevail. Marcus's sister was pressed against the glass window separating her from the execution chamber, tears streaming down her face, her hand flat against the glass as if trying to touch her brother through the barrier, her lips moving in prayers of gratitude and wonder. The chaplain who had prayed with Marcus earlier stood with his hands raised toward heaven, tears flowing freely, his voice joining with Marcus's mother in spontaneous worship and thanksgiving. But Marcus wasn't finished speaking. He could feel Jesus standing beside him invisibly, could sense divine power flowing through him, giving him strength and authority, and the words that needed to be spoken in this moment, that would define everything that followed. "Listen to me, all of you," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos, commanding attention in a way that his natural personality never could have achieved, but that supernatural anointing made inevitable and undeniable. What you are witnessing tonight is not just about me, not just about Marcus Washington, and his wrongful conviction and his miraculous resurrection. This is about a system that has been grinding up black bodies for 400 years, from slavery to lynching to mass incarceration to executions of innocent people. This is about a justice system that sees skin color before it sees humanity, that presumes black guilt and white innocence, that values conviction rates over truth and political careers over actual justice. How many other innocent black men have been executed by the state of Texas? How many other Marcus Washingtons died on this very gurney without resurrection, without vindication, without anyone caring enough to investigate whether the evidence was real or manufactured, whether the witnesses were truthful or lying, whether the jury was impartial or prejudiced? God brought me back tonight, not just to save my life, but to expose what has been hidden, to reveal what has been denied, to make it impossible for people to continue ignoring the racism that poisons every level of the criminal justice system. You cannot explain away what you have seen tonight with medical terminology or scientific theories. My heart stopped. I was dead. The medical examiner with all his training and expertise declared me deceased. And now I am alive again, resurrected by the power of God, returned from death to bear witness to truth. Every camera in this room recorded my death. Every witness here can testify that I stopped breathing, stopped moving, stopped existing in any biological sense. And those same cameras recorded my resurrection. Those same witnesses are now watching me speak to you from beyond death. The truth cannot be denied any longer. The corruption cannot be hidden. The racism cannot be excused or minimized or explained away as individual bad actors rather than systematic evil. Kenneth Morrison lied under oath because detectives pressured him into false identification. Detective Crawford planted evidence because he believed the end justified the means. Prosecutor Chen excluded black jurors because he knew white jurors would be more likely to convict a black defendant. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, which is to say it destroyed an innocent black man and would have killed me tonight if God had not intervened miraculously and undeniably. But God did intervene. Jesus Christ came to my cell last night and promised me that my death would not be the end, that my resurrection would shake the foundations of this corrupt system, that my story would set others free, and I chose to trust him. I chose to go through with this execution, to experience death, to let them pump poison into my veins and stop my heart, because Jesus promised he would bring me back. I died so that the truth could be revealed in a way that cannot be dismissed or ignored. I went through death and resurrection so that other innocent people on death row might be saved, so that the systematic racism that condemned me would be exposed, so that the world would have to confront the reality that God sees injustice and responds to it, that divine intervention is real, that miracles still happen in modern America when God decides to demonstrate his power and his commitment to justice. The warden finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This is impossible," he said, shaking his head as if trying to wake from a nightmare. "People don't come back from death. There must be some medical explanation. The heart monitor must have malfunctioned. The medical examiner must have made an error. This cannot be what it appears to be." Marcus looked directly at the warden, and his eyes seemed to glow with inner light that had nothing to do with the harsh fluorescent bulbs illuminating the execution chamber. "Check the equipment," Marcus said calmly. "Review the video footage. Examine me medically. Do whatever you need to do to convince yourself that what you witnessed was real." My heart stopped beating for exactly 3 minutes and 7 seconds. I had no pulse, no respiration, no brain activity, no signs of life whatsoever. I was clinically dead by every medical and legal standard. And now I am alive again, completely healthy, suffering no brain damage from oxygen deprivation, showing no effects from the lethal chemicals you pumped into my bloodstream. This is a miracle, Warden. This is divine intervention. This is God Almighty declaring that Marcus Washington is innocent and that this execution was an act of murder being committed by the state against one of his beloved children. You can accept that reality, or you can spend the rest of your life trying to explain it away, but the truth remains unchanged regardless of whether you acknowledge it. I died and God brought me back to life to prove my innocence and expose the corruption that condemned me. The medical examiner, a man named Dr. Richard Stevens, who had been certifying execution deaths for 15 years, approached the gurney with trembling hands, pulling out his stethoscope with movements that seemed mechanical and automatic rather than conscious and deliberate. He placed the stethoscope against Marcus's chest, listened for a long moment, then pulled back as if the heartbeat he heard was physically painful to him. "Your heart is beating," he said in a voice filled with confusion and disbelief. "Strong and steady, approximately 72 beats per minute, completely normal rhythm, no irregularities whatsoever. 3 minutes ago I examined you and found no heartbeat, no pulse, no respiration. I pronounced you dead with absolute certainty, because you exhibited every clinical sign of death. I have examined hundreds of deceased individuals in my career. I know what death looks like, what death sounds like, what death feels like when I search for vital signs that aren't there. You were dead, Mr. Washington. By every measure I know how to apply, you were definitively and completely dead. And now you are alive and healthy as if nothing happened, as if you didn't just die from a cocktail of lethal chemicals specifically designed to stop the human heart permanently and irreversibly. I have no medical explanation for this. I have no scientific framework that accommodates what I just witnessed. If I had not seen it myself, if we did not have video footage and multiple witnesses, I would never believe that such a thing was possible. But I cannot deny the evidence of my own senses. You died and you came back to life, and I have absolutely no explanation for how that happened." One of the guards, a young man who had only been working in the execution unit for 6 months, fell to his knees and began praying loudly. "It's a miracle," he said, his voice cracking with emotion and wonder and fear. "Jesus brought him back from the dead just like he did with Lazarus in the Bible. I watched him die. We all watched him die. And now he's alive again because God wanted to show us that he's innocent, that we were about to murder an innocent man." Other guards began backing away from the execution chamber, some of them crossing themselves, others simply staring in shock, their training and protocols completely inadequate for dealing with supernatural intervention in a modern maximum security prison. The warden tried to maintain some semblance of control and authority. "Everyone remain calm," he ordered, though his own voice betrayed his agitation and confusion. We need to secure the prisoner. We need to get medical personnel in here to evaluate him. We need to contact the governor's office immediately. We need to preserve the integrity of the scene. But even as he spoke, he seemed to realize how absurd his words sounded, how completely inadequate standard operating procedures were for dealing with a resurrection. The lawyer who had been appointed to represent Marcus during his final appeals, a woman named Sarah Chen who had believed in his innocence but had been unable to prove it through conventional legal channels, now stood in the witness area with tears streaming down her face and her hands pressed against the glass window. "Marcus," she shouted, her voice carrying through the glass, "Marcus, I always knew you were innocent. I tried everything I could think of to prove it, filed every motion, pursued every avenue of appeal, but the courts wouldn't listen. They wouldn't even consider the possibility that the conviction was unjust, but God listened. God saw what I couldn't prove. God vindicated you in a way that no court ever could. This changes everything. This gives us grounds to reopen your case, to investigate the corruption, to hold people accountable for what they did to you. You're going to be free, Marcus. You're going to go home to your family. You're going to get your life back." Marcus looked at Sarah and smiled, a genuine smile of peace and gratitude, and the kind of joy that only comes from surviving something that should have destroyed you, but instead made you stronger, made you a witness, made you a living testimony to divine power and divine justice. "I know, Sarah," he said gently. "Jesus told me last night that my death would lead to my vindication, that my resurrection would set me free and set others free as well. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about every innocent person on death row, every black man who has been crushed by a system designed to crush us, every victim of racism and corruption and injustice who thought no one cared about their suffering. God cared, God saw, God acted, and now the whole world is going to know what happened here tonight. Now the system is going to have to confront its own evil because God just performed a miracle that cannot be explained away or ignored or dismissed. I am proof that divine intervention is real, that God still works wonders, that resurrection power is not just ancient history but present reality. And I will spend the rest of my life telling this story, bearing witness to what Jesus did for me, fighting for justice for others who are suffering what I suffered." The hours that followed Marcus's resurrection were a blur of medical examinations, official statements, frantic phone calls to government officials, and an international media frenzy, unlike anything the Texas Department of Criminal Justice had ever experienced. Marcus was examined by multiple doctors, all of whom confirmed that he was perfectly healthy, showing no signs of the brain damage that should have resulted from 3 minutes without oxygen, no effects from the lethal chemicals that should have killed him permanently, no physical evidence that he had been dead except for the medical records and video footage that documented beyond any doubt that his heart had stopped, and he had exhibited no vital signs for exactly 3 minutes and 7 seconds. The governor of Texas, awakened in the middle of the night with the news that an executed prisoner had come back to life, initially refused to believe what he was being told, insisting that there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding, some rational explanation that didn't involve supernatural resurrection in a state execution chamber. But when he watched the video footage, when he heard the testimony of the medical examiner and the guards and the warden and the witnesses, when he was confronted with the undeniable reality that Marcus Washington had died and returned to life, he had no choice but to acknowledge that something extraordinary had occurred, something that demanded immediate action and investigation. Within 12 hours of Marcus's resurrection, the governor issued an executive order halting all executions in Texas, pending a comprehensive review of death row cases, particularly those involving black defendants, all white juries, and questionable evidence. Within 24 hours, Kenneth Morrison had turned himself in to authorities and given a full confession, admitting that he had lied about identifying Marcus, that he had been pressured and manipulated by detectives who needed a witness to support their theory of the case, that he had allowed his desire for importance and validation to override his conscience and his responsibility to tell the truth. Within 48 hours, Detective James Crawford had been arrested and charged with evidence tampering and perjury, his long history of misconduct finally catching up with him now that God had exposed his crimes in the most dramatic way possible. Within 72 hours, Prosecutor Robert Chen had resigned his position and was facing disbarment proceedings and potential criminal charges for his systematic exclusion of black jurors and his knowing use of false testimony. And within 1 week of his resurrection, Marcus Washington was released from Huntsville State Penitentiary, all charges against him dropped, his conviction vacated, his innocence officially acknowledged by the state that had tried to kill him. The moment he walked through the prison gates as a free man, Marcus was mobbed by his family who had waited outside since his resurrection, refusing to leave until they could embrace him without glass between them, until they could touch him and confirm that he was real and alive and truly free. Angela threw herself into his arms with such force that they both nearly fell. 12 years of separation and suffering and faith finally rewarded with reunion. She kissed his face, his hands, his neck, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to form words, just holding him and being held by him. Jasmine, now 26 years old and barely recognizable as the 14-year-old girl Marcus had last embraced, clung to him and whispered over and over, "I knew you were innocent, Daddy. I always knew. I never stopped believing." Marcus Jr., 23 and looking so much like a younger version of Marcus himself, stood with his arms around both parents, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with the release of years of accumulated pain and anger and helplessness. And Elijah, 19 years old now, meeting his father as an adult for the first time since childhood, simply stood and stared as if trying to convince himself this was real, that his father was actually here, that prayers had been answered and miracles had happened. The media coverage of Marcus Washington's resurrection and exoneration was immediate, intense, and international in scope. Every major news network in the world covered the story, showing the video footage of Marcus dying on the execution gurney and then returning to life 3 minutes later, interviewing witnesses who testified that they had watched him die and then watched him resurrect, examining the medical evidence that confirmed he had been clinically dead with no heartbeat and no brain activity. Religious leaders of every denomination weighed in on the theological implications of a modern-day resurrection, with some declaring it clear evidence of divine intervention and others struggling to reconcile their theology with the undeniable video evidence of a miracle. Scientists attempted to find naturalistic explanations for what had occurred, suggesting rare medical conditions or equipment malfunctions or misdiagnosis, but every proposed explanation crumbled under the weight of evidence, the testimony of multiple medical professionals, and the clear documentation of Marcus's death and resurrection. The criminal justice reform movement seized on Marcus's story as irrefutable proof that the death penalty was fundamentally flawed, that innocent people were being executed, that racism permeated every level of the system from arrests to convictions to sentencing to executions. Activists pointed out that if God had not miraculously intervened, Marcus Washington would have been buried as an executed murderer, another innocent black man killed by a system designed to kill black men, his name forgotten, his truth never revealed, his family left to mourn a father and husband stolen from them by state-sanctioned murder. The fact that divine intervention had been necessary to prevent this injustice, activists argued, proved that human systems of justice were inadequate and corrupt, particularly when applied to black defendants. Within months of Marcus's resurrection, 17 other death row inmates in Texas alone had their cases reopened based on similarities to Marcus's case, evidence of racism in jury selection, questionable forensic evidence or witness testimony that appeared to have been coached or coerced. Of those 17 cases, 11 resulted in overturned convictions and releases of innocent people who had spent years or decades on death row for crimes they did not commit. The detective who had investigated Marcus's case, James Crawford, was eventually revealed to have planted evidence or manipulated witnesses in at least 37 other cases during his career, resulting in a cascade of exonerations that exposed the depth of corruption in the Houston Police Department. The prosecutor, Robert Chen, was disbarred and convicted of misconduct, becoming a symbol of prosecutorial overreach and the dangers of prioritizing conviction rates over truth and justice. Kenneth Morrison, the witness whose false identification had been instrumental in Marcus's conviction, became an advocate for criminal justice reform himself, traveling around the country to speak about the dangers of eyewitness testimony and the ways that witnesses can be unconsciously or deliberately manipulated into false identifications, particularly in cross-racial identifications where white witnesses are identifying black suspects. But Marcus Washington himself became something more than just an ex-honoree or an advocate for criminal justice reform. He became a living testimony to the reality of divine intervention, to the truth that God sees injustice and responds to it, to the promise that resurrection power is not just ancient history, but present reality available to those who trust in Jesus Christ. He spoke in churches and prisons and colleges and conferences, always telling the same story in vivid detail. The story of the night Jesus came to cell block D, the story of the choice to trust God through death and into resurrection, the story of 3 minutes in paradise, between death and new life, the story of returning to his body on the execution gurney with a message that could not be denied or dismissed. Some people who heard his testimony believed immediately, their hearts resonating with truth, their spirits confirming that what Marcus described was real and authentic and consistent with the character of the God revealed in Scripture. Others remained skeptical, preferring naturalistic explanations or simply dismissing the entire event as fraud or delusion despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But no one, absolutely no one, could deny that Marcus Washington had been pronounced dead by qualified medical professionals using standard protocols, and had returned to life 3 minutes later in full view of cameras and witnesses, or that his case had been riddled with corruption and racism, or that his exoneration had led to reforms and revelations that exposed systematic injustices throughout the Texas criminal justice system. Marcus and Angela renewed their wedding vows in a ceremony that was broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world, a celebration not just of their love, but of their perseverance through 12 years of separation, of their faith that had survived even when circumstances suggested that faith was foolish, of their willingness to trust God even when trust seemed to lead nowhere except deeper into suffering. Their children stood beside them during the ceremony, all three of them testifying to the ways that their father's wrongful conviction and miraculous resurrection had shaped their own faith and their understanding of justice, and their commitment to fighting for others who were suffering similar injustices. Jasmine had become a civil rights lawyer, dedicating her career to representing wrongfully convicted individuals. Marcus Jr. had become a social worker, focusing on supporting families of incarcerated people. Elijah had become a documentary filmmaker, creating films that exposed racism in the criminal justice system and told the stories of people whose suffering had been ignored or dismissed by mainstream media. Marcus established a foundation dedicated to supporting ex-onrees and their families, helping people rebuild their lives after wrongful conviction, providing resources for housing and employment and counseling in community, creating a network of support for people who had survived the kind of nightmare that Marcus had endured. He worked closely with the Innocence Project and similar organizations to identify other potentially innocent people on death row, to investigate their cases, to pursue their exonerations, to ensure that what happened to him, the miracle that saved his life, would lead to justice for others who might not receive miraculous intervention, but still deserved freedom and vindication. He never forgot the young black man he had seen in that other cell during his spiritual journey with Jesus, the one with dead eyes who had given up hope, and he made it his mission to bring hope to people in similar situations, to remind them that they were not forgotten, that their lives mattered, that God saw them even when the world refused to look. Years passed and Marcus Washington's story became part of American history, studied in law schools and theology programs, debated in academic journals and popular media, referenced in Supreme Court cases dealing with the death penalty and criminal justice reform. The execution chamber where Marcus had died and been resurrected was eventually closed permanently, the state of Texas unable to justify continuing to use a facility where God had demonstrated so dramatically his opposition to the execution of innocent people. It became a museum and memorial, a place where visitors could see the gurney where Marcus had lain dead, could watch the video footage of his death and resurrection, could learn about the corruption that had condemned him, and the reforms that his resurrection had inspired. On the 10th anniversary of his resurrection, Marcus returned to that execution chamber with his family, standing in the place where he had died and returned to life, reflecting on everything that had changed in the decades since that extraordinary night. "I died here," he said to the crowd of reporters and supporters and exonerees who had gathered for the anniversary, his voice strong and clear and filled with conviction that came from lived experience rather than abstract theology. "I felt my heart stop beating, felt my breath cease, felt my spirit separate from my body and rise toward heaven. I was dead by every medical and legal definition, gone from this world, finished with earthly existence. But Jesus Christ, the same Jesus who rose from the dead 2,000 years ago, reached into death and pulled me back to life, because my story wasn't finished, because truth needed to be told, because others needed to be set free. I came back with a message that I have been proclaiming for 10 years, and will continue proclaiming until I die again. This time of natural causes many years from now. The message is this: God sees injustice. God cares about the oppressed. God responds to the cries of the innocent. Divine intervention is real. Resurrection power is available. And no system, no matter how entrenched or powerful or corrupt, can stand against the purposes of God when he decides to demonstrate his power and his commitment to justice. I am Marcus Washington, resurrected from death, exonerated from false conviction, restored to my family, redeemed by the grace and power of Jesus Christ. My life is a testimony to the truth that what looks like the end is often just the beginning, that what seems like defeat is actually setting the stage for victory, that God specializes in bringing life from death, hope from despair, freedom from bondage, and justice from corruption. I pray that my story gives hope to everyone who is suffering injustice, everyone who is fighting a system that seems unbeatable, everyone who feels abandoned and forgotten, and crushed by circumstances beyond their control. You are not alone. God sees you, God knows your suffering, and God will vindicate you. Maybe not through resurrection like he did for me, but through some other demonstration of his power, and his love and his commitment to making all things right. Trust him, even through death, even through suffering, even when hope seems impossible. Trust him all the way through to the resurrection morning that will surely come. The cruelty of a system that sees color before innocence reflects how power can destroy human dignity. But the beauty of this story is transformation. When Jesus intervened, he didn't just heal Marcus physically, he changed hearts of stone. Sometimes we believe God doesn't see our suffering, that our sacrifices are meaningless. But Marcus proves that true faith isn't measured by blessings received, but by the love we keep giving when everything seems lost. The most powerful moment was when Marcus, broken and desperate, chose to trust through death itself. That unconditional faith attracted divine intervention. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Share this video with someone who needs to remember they're never alone in their struggles. What do you think? Have you known someone like Marcus who sacrificed everything for family? Or maybe you've experienced God's presence in your darkest moment? Tell us your story in the comments. Every testimony can inspire thousands facing similar situations. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories that transform hearts.